Hello everybody and welcome to this presentation. Today I'm going to be talking about how you use CSS in Arbortext Layout Developer. My name's Simon Taylor, I'm the product manager for Layout Developer and Styler and some other stuff here at PTC. CSS was introduced in 12.1.2.0 which was released in November last year. And this presentation is going to show you how you can get started with it and how you can use the config file to set up your CSS. So here's the agenda. First we're going to look at the introduction, why we added CSS, what we did to add CSS and how it works inside ALD. And then we'll go on to some more technical stuff where we look at the system files which we introduced, some of the sample files, then we'll look at how you go about associating CSS with your XML content, and then how you get to use the page layout features which are provided with CSS. And then in the third section we'll look at the config file and the different things that you can set inside there to make your CSS more applicable to you and the documents that you're formatting. So let's start with the introduction. So why did we add CSS support to Layout Developer when Layout Developer's already got a pretty complete layout and formatting API? Well, there's a number of different reasons for this. We did have some CSS support in Layout Developer a long time ago, but it wasn't finished and it was hidden away quite a bit, and you really had to struggle to make it work, and it didn't really work that well. So 2 years ago we decided let's make a better stab at implementing CSS in Layout Developer. So we released that firstly in 12.20, and hopefully we'll be adding more to it as time goes on. What we wanted to do is provide users a way of really easily getting started with Layout Developer, and CSS seemed like the right approach. Web development developers are great template developers. They can already have a good understanding of JavaScript, so they can use the formatting object model nicely, and they also now have a good idea of how you can associate styling with structured content. So using CSS is great for web developers to be able to get started. And also, in that respect, it makes it easier for new users to get to grips with Layout Developer and format some XML. CSS is a growing and living standard, and as time goes on, they have added an awful lot more page layout functionality and stuff which is right in Layout Developer's sweet spot. So starting to add some CSS support now seemed like a really good idea in that respect. And to be frank, we had a bit of a competitive gap with other layout tools, so it was made good business sense to close that gap. We've based our CSS support on CSS3, so we've used as many CSS selectors, property, display types and page rules as we possibly can from those specs. Hopefully, with the addition of some new features in the next couple of years, we'll be able to sort of round out that support even more. One of the important things about our implementation is that it can work alongside other template development modes. So you can still use context control streams and you can still use tag matching to apply styling as well as using CSS3. And there is a function, if you're already aware of it in your template code, you can turn on and off context matching and tag matching, and you can also turn on and off CSS matching as well if you want to do that. And so you can either run everything using CSS and CSS alone, or you can use CSS with tag matching or CSS with context control streams. As this is Layout Developer, we didn't just want to say, right, bang, here you go, this is how you use CSS, and only give you one way of working. So we try to make it as flexible and as usable as we possibly can in line with the Layout Developer sort of design ethos. So what have we added? We've added a number of different ways that you can associate CSS style sheets with XML streams, and we'll talk about those in depth in a little while. So you can do it globally by associating a CSS with the XML, or you can apply CSS in line, which is kind of handy. We've added via a new startup file, we've added a whole load of functions, and those functions are associated with each of the properties, and there's a whole load of stuff which happens before you go into a node and come out of a node, and all those functions are wrapped up in this system file, and they describe and provide functions for processing all the different display types and formatting properties and the layout, page layout descriptions. Each of the properties themselves has an on-enter and on-exit function. So as you're going into a node, you can turn on a load of stuff, and as you come out of a node, you can turn it off. Similar to the context control stream stuff. We've also provided through the config file a way to configure functions. So you can specify initial and default values for properties, you can generate logs and alerts, and usefully you can add information on the XML nodes as user data if you want, and you can configure that in the config file. We've also provided some sample files which demonstrate how those things work, and we'll look at each of those in turn. So to give you an idea of how it works inside Layout Developer, so at the beginning of formatting, ALD will parse a style sheet and collect up all the different selectors and style definitions. It uses the selectors to know which elements and context need to be matched. So similar to a context control stream, it'll pick up use the selectors to pick up exactly which contexts and elements need to be matched, and then it'll know that this element in this context has a certain display type, and then when it gets to that node in the XML, it'll apply that display type and then apply the properties which are defined in the style sheet. If you've got page definition, page handling turned on, at the beginning of formatting, ALD will process any of the page definitions, and it'll do run a number of functions which will build the page layouts and the page sequences necessary. And we'll talk about how you turn on and use page definitions a little bit later. As ALD is formatting through the content, at each XML node, it'll run a number of functions. It'll run functions on the way into the node, like the on-enter stuff, and it'll run functions on the way out of the node, so the on-exit stuff. So it runs three sort of groups of functions, really. There's a display pre function, which sets up a bunch of objects and some state information and clears away any sort of legacy stuff. Then it will process each of the CSS properties which are defined for that context using their on-enter function. So each of the properties has an on-enter and an on-exit version of the function. And so on the way into the node, it'll run the on-enter version. And then it'll hit the display start function, and that applies all the properties and creates the right display object. So it could be a block or inline or a list item, that kind of thing. And it'll do that last out of this group of functions. And once it's done that, it will carry on with the rest of the formatting. On the way out of the node, it kind of does things backwards. So it'll do run the display end function, which doesn't do an awful lot, to be honest. If there are on-exit versions of the property functions, then it will run those, and then there will be a display post function which closes off any of the formatting objects. So if you've created a block in the display start function, then the display post will close off that function, that block rather, and make everything tidy. So that gives you a rough idea of what we added and why we added it and how we added it to Layout Developer. Let's have a look now at how you would actually go about using CSS in Layout Developer. In this release, we've provided 3 new system files. So the first one is scss.min.js. This is a JavaScript file, and this contains all the functions and object declarations for supporting CSS in ALD. So don't delete that one if you want to use CSS. We provide a minimized version, but that's only really to make it more efficient. We're not trying to hide anything or anything. Could have done that in different ways. The file is run when ALD starts as well. So that creates a global JavaScript object _CSS, and everything to do with CSS is attached to that. So all the different functions for the properties, those display start and pre functions and everything inside there is attached to that _CSS object, and that's global to JavaScript inside ALD. There's also a config file, cssconfig.js. That's called by the very start of scss.min.js, and that contains configuration options for us when we're handling the CSS stuff. So that will be discussed in a later section, and there's different things that you can do inside there. It's kind of a useful file. We also provide a base HTML CSS style sheet. That is used to tell ALD, because it's not a browser, how to format the HTML5 element. So whether to set them up as blocks or inline, or as list items, or as table cells, that kind of thing. So that is HTML base.css. That is called by a script which we can run when we're formatting HTML, and I'll show you how to do that in a little while. And basically, as it says here, it applies what is there by default inside a browser. We've also provided a couple of sample files. There's the CSS demo, which is a version of the demo file, but using CSS to style it rather than JavaScript or processing instructions, and that's in the 3D folder. And also in the samples subfolder of the 3D folder, there's an HTML version of the demo. So this looks very similar to the other one, but this time it uses HTML content rather than XML content. And it contains links to external CSS style sheets, and uses a special method for collecting those CSS styles and applying those, which I'll talk about in a little while. This one also uses the HTML base style sheet, so you can see how that gets included in there too. We were going to ship another one that showed the page layout stuff, but it kind of depended too much on people setting the right things in their config files. But if you want that, and I'll show you that in a little while, if you want that, get in touch with me and I can send it over to you. So let's start looking at how you associate CSS with your XML content in order to make it work and make it format. So the first method we're going to look at, and probably the most simple to use and the most obvious way, is this, what I call here, direct association. So with direct association, you basically use a macro or a fstream property to say, for this stream, apply this CSS style sheet. So there's this tcss3 macro. If you don't put any parameters in it, it will invoke this dialog box where you can select the stream that you want to format and the CSS style sheet tag, the .cs tag that you want to associate with that style sheet. And then that developer will just format it based on that. So here we are in ALD. We have a copy of the demo file, really, pretty much. Got some XML, and it has to be well-formed XML, don't forget, because if you don't have a tree, you can't hang stuff off it. And in this document, we have a CSS file. Let me show you that. There's a CSS tag, .cs tag, has all the necessary styling in order to style this document. So if I can use then the tcss3 macro, I want to select the main text and then the style sheet, apply that and refresh, and everything's styled nicely. So that's this tcss3 macro. The next method that we provided was to use the XML style sheet processing instruction. Now you can use this in other tools, and it lets the XML processor know which style sheet to use. So if you put in at the top of your XML instance a XML style sheet processing instruction, and it has to be at the top of the instance before the root element, then you can point to a style sheet. So that style sheet could either be an external file, excuse my silly quotes, it can either be an external file or it could be a tag. If you're going to use a tag, you use the 0 area that points to inside the document, and then lets you point to a tag, and that'll be the name of the tag there. Now, using the XML style sheet processing instruction is not turned on by default. You have to turn on a document preference to allow that, and that is in the document preferences, document configuration under XML handling. There's an option there, load CSS from XML style sheet PI. Turn that on if you want to use it. There's also a template preference, and now you can see that listed there. To show you that working in Layout Developer then, here we have the same instance, but this time we're using the XML style sheet processing instruction, and there it is at the top of the XML instance. I'm going to be pointing to a tag called CSS style sheet. If we look inside my tags for this document, you can see there's a CSS style sheet, so it's going to point to that. It isn't turned on in the document preferences here at the moment, so let's open up those, go to XML handling, turn that on, hit OK, and there you go, it's automatically styling it using that CSS style sheet. The third method for applying CSS in ALD that we introduced is a little bit more tricky. So the FStream object now has a new property called CSS start, and if that CSS start is a function and that function returns a string which contains CSS definitions, those will be added to the CSS definitions which are being applied for the content stream that's being formatted. So let me go over that again. There's a property on FStream now called CSS start. You should point that to a function, and that function needs to return a string containing CSS definitions. Those CSS definitions are added to the collection of CSS definitions which are applied to the content stream. The HTML sample that we ship uses the CSS start function to collect up any linked CSS and include the HTML base style sheet and any style elements which contain CSS in them inside the HTML. So this script which we provide is here listed here, _css.html start. That is a function which you can apply to the root of your HTML document or even to the containing stream itself. You can set it like this, as you can see down the bottom, and that will go and collect up CSS definitions from HTML base from linked CSS style sheets, so if they're in external files or whatever, or style elements, the contents of style elements. So here we have the HTML demo, and you can see if I browse the tags, there's not a CSS stream in here, but there is a tag, reference tag for HTML. It doesn't have anything in it, but it's there anyway. That's the root element of this chunk of XML, or HTML in this case. If I open up the debugger and look at content.streams.html and then have a look at the properties of that, you can see there's a CSS start function, and that is, you hover over that, you can see that that's a function. Okay, and that function is the one that we've provided as part of the CSS library, and this will go away and it will collect in the HTML base style sheet and any linked style sheets to the HTML, as well as any style definitions inside the HTML. So in this bit of HTML we have this link, and it's going to go and grab the contents of ALD demo CSS and add that to the CSS definitions which come from the HTML base, and if there are other style definitions in here it would use those too. So as a reminder, if you want to use the function that we ship instead of writing your own, the function to call is _css.html start, and that will do the job for you to collect up all the linked and the base HTML style sheets and add those to your CSS processing, which is applied to your content stream. So the fourth and final way that we have of using CSS with content is to use inline application. So there's now a new method on the formatting object, apply CSS, which allows you to take some values, CSS values, and use those. So the method takes 4 arguments. First one is a string, and that string needs to contain the properties that you want to apply. So it could be something like this, where the color's red and the font size is 14 points. The next thing is the mode to use with those properties. So if you remember, each of the property functions has an onEnter and an onExit component. So you would need to say whether you want to use the onEnter or the onExit component. Then you have the ability to apply or not apply the wrapper functions, so the display pre, start, display end, display post functions. So if you are going to use something as an inline, you would want, or a block, then you would want to use these to make sure that all the block stuff is set up for you originally. And then you pass the display type. So the CSS display attribute, you would want to pass that into this function so that it knows what type of object to set up. As I said, whether it sets up a block or an inline or a list item or whatever. So this function can be used, this method can be used quite easily to do inline style application. So if you're formatting some HTML, for example, and that has a style attribute on an element, you can use the contents of that style attribute to apply that stuff inline. To show you an example of that happening, here we are in a copy of the HTML demo. We have a tag, and that tag has some properties applied. And if I open that tag, you can see that I'm getting the attribute, the style attribute, and if it's there, I'm applying those properties using the apply CSS function. So there's the properties going in. I want to use the on enter because it's the beginning of the tag. I want to use the wrapper functions, and I want to make sure it's in line. And so you can see that is applying those properties. And to show you what's going on, I can change this to green, and it'll change the colors to green. You can use all these different methods together if you want. So you can have TCSS3 running as well as the XML style sheet PI and the CSS start function all being in place. And the definitions that you apply are applied in the order that is listed here. So that's kind of an interesting thing. You can create multi-layered style sheets and apply styling from a number of different places at the same time. I guess that's kind of the nature of CSS in the first place. My advice is choose a method which works best for you. Normally it would be either one of methods 1 or 2, so either using the style sheet PI or the direct association, and then if you really need to, use method 3, the CSS start function, to add some extra bits on top if you need to. So the next bit to look at is how we can use the at page descriptors inside CSS to drive page layouts using ALD. So we've tried to implement these as much as we can. So if your CSS contains some of the at page stuff, then you can build page layouts for it. But you need to set up some stuff in order for it to work. The first thing you need to do is turn on in your config file, use pages. That needs to be set to true. If it's not set to true, ALD will just ignore all of the at page functions and not build any of the page layout stuff. So that's quite important. If you do change it in the config file, don't forget to restart ALD, but you can also set it in line from a script if you just want it to not persist if you close ALD. So you can do it just on a one-off process, and then the functions will start using the at page stuff. You also need to use document and page sequence control streams, so you need to have at least a default page sequence set up in order to be able to use the at page stuff, because the functions which are in the at page functions are there to build not only the frames and the pages and the layers, they're there to create the page sequences. You also have to make sure that your CSS has all the bits that you need to build the pages and to call them. So make sure that the at page stuff describes the layouts, and also you're using the page property on different contexts to call the page layouts that you've described. You're going to need some tags as well to make it work with some of the stuff that goes into the content streams. I have a sample file. If it's not shipped, and I'm not 100% sure that it is shipped, let me know. You should know my email address by now, and I can send you the page sample so you can see how that works. And inside there's a couple of tags, content style, which applies styling which is added to the generated content streams which get created, and evaluate counter, which lets you evaluate page counters. So here I am in my page layout sample. Pages look a little bit rubbish and there's no CSS being applied. If I reformat, it looks even worse. the CSS is applied to the content, but it's not applying any page layouts, and that's because I haven't set the config option to true. So I can do that in the debugger. Let's fire that up. Here's the debugger. I can put in the command here. You can also do this in the macro bar using the JS macro. If I reset that to true and then reformat, it'll create pages, create page layouts. As you can see, as you page through, it's got loads of different layouts using the different boxes which the CSS spec specifies. Up here, these are generated content streams. It's got this content style tag which I was talking about, which will take some values which are stored in some objects and apply those. And then you have the evaluate counter, which will evaluate the page counter and the pages counter. So if you want a copy of this, let me know, and you can use these versions of the style tags. Let's have a quick look at the CSS that's here then. Let's put that in the yellow bar. So there's a whole load of CSS in there to describe the text formatting, and then here at the bottom we have page stuff. So here we're describing an article set of pages. We've got the first page in it, the left page, and the right page. Each of these other little boxes, these rules within here, describe the different regions which get built on the page. So here we have the top center, which on the left page, which is the one that we got open at the moment, the background is going to be yellow, text is going to be blue, and all those properties. And here the content, so this is the stream which is going to get written into the content inside that frame, is going to be that. This counter page stuff will generate those tags that you saw for evaluate counter, CSS evaluate counter. The style properties are stored on an object, and so you can pull those out using the CSS style or content style, kind of what it is, the tag that's inside there, content style. So there you go. CSS describes a number of different regions on the page. It's a little bit further on than what was described in XSLFO, but it's not an awful lot more useful. You basically have boxes across the top and the bottom, left and right, as well as the main content area, and it uses the margin system to push the content in from the edges. You can apply border rules to the boxes, you can apply background colors, and you can apply text styling. So if you want to use the app page stuff, that's the way that you would go about using it. So that describes how you would use CSS. The next section to talk about is the config file. So if you remember, one of the new system files is the CSS config.js file, and this section now will describe what's going on in there and why you might find it useful. So as I mentioned, the CSS config.js system file allows you to configure some of the functions which are used in CSS, as well as providing some default and initial values for some other properties which are already there. So there are 11 main sections in there. We're not going to go spend too long on them, but we'll skip through them one by one. But you can use them to turn on pages, as you've just seen. There's some logging and warning stuff in there. There's some information about table elements and properties and list properties. You can set the initial values, and you can set up some page defaults too if you want. So let's look at some of the content of the config file then. So the first thing you've seen already is the use pages. By default that's set to false, but you can use that to set it to true if you want a global setting to use the CSS page rules. Then we have some logging preferences. So most of the functions have the ability to output logs, so you can see which functions are being used and which properties are being set. You can set the type an alert, so using application.alert, or you can write the logging information to a stream, to an external file, or you can pass it to a variable if you want. So if you're going to write it to a stream or a file or a variable, the output name, log output name, is the name of that thing that you want to create. If you're going to write it to an external file, then this log file path will give you the location of where you want to write that file to. So if you call it CSS log messages and it's at this location, a file called CSS log messages will be created at that location. Then we have a number of ways of turning on and off different warnings and alerts. So there's a warning option. So if features are unsupported, then we have some code in there which will say this is unsupported but you're still using it, so you can turn that on. By default that's set to off. If you want to turn on these alerts, so these alerts will say I'm going into this function, this is the value that I'm applying to this property, then you can turn that on to true. Another option that we have here is the ability to turn user data on. So when properties are functions are run, you can store the value of those properties on the node as user data, and turning this on allows you to do something, and I'll show you how that could possibly work in a sec. There's also a way of using the user data to generate an alert. So you can write the user data alert mode, set that to true, and if you're interested in some particular properties being set, then you can list those properties here in this array. So if you want to be alerted when these values are being set on as user data, then you can do that too. So here's a reason why you might want to use user data, and this is an example which I can give you if you want. Let me know and I'll package this up and send it over to you. So user data is turned on. So for each of the properties which are being processed from the CSS, it's stored on the node. And I've created a little dialog box here which will list the CSS properties which are applied. So as these are stored as user data, all the script associated with this dialog box needs to do is loop through the properties that it's aware of, pick out the values and display them in the list. So if I can click around inside the content here, and I can see the CSS properties which are applied at this point. So all this information is stored as user data, and you can sort of get at it and find out what's applied to the nodes in your XML if you want to. You can see something interesting here. We've got the font shorthand property, which has a number of different properties within it, and those are decomposed into the individual properties. So you can see that those 16 px font size is there, and the line height is there, and so on. So not only is the font property set, but also the specific individual sub properties are also set. Some more items which are set in the config file. There's the fish bucket to use. So as you know, you have 5 buckets of fish variables. By default, the CSS uses fish number 1, but if that conflicts with some other fish variables that you're using inside your template, then you can reset that to something else, and it would use that. There's not that much information stored in fish, but we do use fish to store some, and we wouldn't want that to conflict with the stuff that you've got. So you can have an option there to change the fish bucket that you're using. When formatting tables, there's 3 attributes which are used. We didn't want to hide one of those in, so we have a feature which allows you to specify what the attribute values, attribute names are. So you can style using CSS elements as table cell or table column, that kind of thing. And if values are set like span and col span and row span, they're using attributes, and those attributes aren't the ones which are defined in HTML, like span, col span and row span, then you can specify different ones there if you want to use CSS to drive your table layout. By default in HTML, list item labels are 2 ems wide. If you want them bigger or smaller, then you can have there's an option there to set that default width, which is kind of handy. If you want to set an alternative location for your HTML base style sheet, so by default it's in the installation folder, but if you want it somewhere else and pick it up from somewhere else, say you've got a customization of it, for example, then you can specify that in the config file too. We also have a big long list of the initial values. So the CSS specification describes the initial values for all of its properties, and so if you use the initial value of a property, or set a property to a value of initial, then these are the values which will be applied. So if I pop open the config file, you can see that all the properties that we have an initial value set. So it'll be pulled from the config file. So if you want to change the initial value of any of the properties, then you can do so there. The final group of properties in the config file that I want to talk about are all related to pages. So the first section is page sizes. So the CSS spec describes some default page sizes and some names for the page sizes, and there's a number of different ones of those. You know, there's standard A4, A3, that kind of thing. And so those sizes are specified in the config file. So if you want to change auto to something else, then you can change it inside there if you want. If you want to add some more named page sizes, then you can do that too in the config file. There's some other defaults for the default page layout. So if you want to use something called _default, then those can be set. So you can specify the height and the width and some other properties of those. There's also a list of the named page boxes and the order the boxes are created, and that's down at the bottom of the config file. So let me have a quick look in here. So there's the page sizes. So these are the named page sizes that we support. If you want to add others, then you can do that inside here. These are the heights and widths. These are the default page defaults. So you can see that there's the height and width, the margin top, bottom, left and right. And this is the names of the page boxes which get created. So each of those different regions on the page are created in this order. So we create the main one first and then stack the other ones up in this order. This order is specified in the CSS spec, but if you want to change that order, then you can do that in here too. So hopefully that's given you a good overview of CSS, how to use it, and what's available in Layout Developer 12.1.20. There's more information in the documentation under the new feature stuff, but if you have any issues or any problems, don't forget, you know where I am. If you want any of the sample files, give me a shout. Thank you very much for your time.